Hello, everyone, and welcome back for our next lecture in our Early Republic series. I have not mentioned it up to this point, but just to inform all of those in my class, we will kind of take a hiatus at the end of semester with this unit. We will actually not finish the unit itself. It's going to be kind of a midpoint that we're going to pause and we're going to come back to. At this point, or at least when we get done with our lecture series for this semester, you'll probably be about 75% of the way done with this unit. But when we come back from break, we will take a look at the presidencies, the first three presidencies, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, and we'll actually work our way up to the War of 1812, and that'll be the end of the Early Republic unit. So I know not too many classes have units span the course of 2 semesters, but this is one of those. Now today we are going to focus on a topic that I know for many of you are probably very interested in. If you are a fan of the Hamilton musical, get your ears ready because today is your day. Now we are, and by the way, I am so happy that Hamilton has been such a smash success. I think it is great. I think it's been a wonderful new look that's introduced a whole new generation of Americans to the stories of this era. So I am, you know what? I go out and see it. If it sparks interest in history, I love it. All right, it's good. So we are going to be taking a look at who Alexander Hamilton was, but more so in the vein of how his political ideals and how his political philosophy really helped shape the early Republican government. And he is going to be really toe-to-toe with Thomas Jefferson, okay? And from here on out, I'm going to talk about you're either a Hamiltonian or you're a Jeffersonian, because these two men have very opposite ideas on what the early republic should become. They had different visions of what America should be. And frankly, Hamilton's was very centered on manufacturing and like industry and cities becoming more powerful, whereas Jefferson was the opposite. He believed that the future of America was agrarian and that, you know, the ideal American was kind of this individual yeoman farmer that, reaped what he sowed and, much different mindsets. And this is going to be our focus for the last part of our lecture series here. So without further ado, and today might be a little bit of a lengthier one, I apologize, but there's a lot to say about Hamilton. For not being a president, he was very influential in our party system, in how this early republic is shaping, and mainly because he had the ear of perhaps the most powerful man of all, and that is George Washington. So without further ado, get your notes ready. We're going to go ahead and get rolling with our next section in the early republic. So like I began, I said, Hamilton's vision of America was quite different. His personal beliefs on government were quite different from Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton's going to represent more so a northern style of thinking, where, of course, more cities were located, more manufacturing, and, of course, Jefferson more southern. He himself owning slaves, having a plantation. So we'll get into some of the differences, but let me explain more so about Hamilton. Now, Hamilton was a very strong nationalist, okay? And I want you to understand a nationalist. So he is out there, he is promoting a federal government. Remember, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He had opposed the Articles of Confederation early on, and he had written most of the Federalist Papers at the time that they were all published. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. He was often seen as kind of an elitist, though, so he often turned people off, but was extremely influential in his ideas of government. He sought stronger ties with Britain. That's an important piece that I'd like you to know, because that's going to become an increasing division in America. How friendly should we be with Britain? Now, in Hamilton's eyes, he's saying, listen, Britain's the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful economy. And yes, I know we just got done with a war with them, but if we want to have a stronger economy, we better closely link ourselves with Britain. Whereas men like Jefferson, who are more closely aligned with France, are saying, no, Britain's represents everything that's bad about the world, tyrannical. I mean, we're the opposite of Britain now. So they're pushing away from that style of governance and economy. Now, one thing I want to go back to focus on that idea of being more of a nationalist. One thing, if you've seen the musical, you probably understand this. Hamilton was very different from the rest of the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, because he was actually not born in America. He was born in the Caribbean, and he was actually a bastard in the traditional sense of the word. He did not have a father growing up. And at a very early age, in fact, he showed a lot of promise. He was very, very smart, very, very well educated, even on this small, remote Caribbean island. And people on the island actually raised money to send him to America, knowing that he could get an even better education there, could be influential. And so that is how Hamilton came to America. I'm telling you this because I think this really is partly what inspires his nationalistic beliefs. Okay, he sees America as one country, whereas all these other founding fathers are born in specific states that they see as their country. Jefferson was a Virginian, first and foremost, before he was an American. All right, and for us in 2020, I think that's a little bit harder to understand that you could have such loyalty to one state. But remember, this is a time period where most people did not leave their state. Most people did not travel more than 10 miles outside their home in their lifetime. So your state was your country. But for Hamilton, his country was America, and he saw it as a unified, singular, organization instead of individual states. So I think that really shapes his vision of America. So what is it that he actually wants? And I'll give you three things here, and I'm sorry, I'm still on personal belief. I told you it's going to be a long one. Personal beliefs of government. Number one, manufacturing. Make sure you understand Hamilton is going to continually push that the future of America is in manufacturing. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And, even though we're talking about, textile mills like clothing and whatnot, hasn't gotten to like steel production yet. What he's seeing is the beginning of that Industrial Revolution where mass production is the future. So he did think that to promote American economy, the best future was going to be in industry and manufacturing. That was what would make America the strongest. Number two, he is going to push the implied powers of the Constitution. Now, this is where he really rubs people the wrong way. Remember, there's a very strong concern about the government being tyrannical and having too much power as a federal government. He's going to be one that kind of pushes that envelope. He says that there are implied powers, things that the government can do that are not listed in the Constitution. And we'll give you some specific examples later on, but things like the National Bank. We'll go more into detail. And of course, he actually ends up winning that argument where, there are implied powers and the courts do side with him. The third issue I want you to know that kind of define his personal beliefs on government is about federalism. Of course, as I mentioned in the introduction here, he is a strong proponent of federalism. And again, I think that is highly linked to the fact that he was not born here and he sees America as a country, not necessarily more loyalty to his state. Now let's get into his role as his official capacity in the government. In 1790, he becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. He is the first treasurer for our country. And it's during that time that he will submit a number of reports to Congress on kind of his ideas on where the nation should head and kind of policy stances, really. And so we're going to talk about those 4 reports because they really outline his thinking. Now, before I get into those, I want to remind you that he was very influential even before this. He had been the aide-de-camp to Washington, kind of his right-hand man during the American Revolution. Remember, he's the one that talked Washington even into taking the presidency. He has the ear of America at this time, and so these reports are highly influential in our thinking, in our understanding of this early republic and what they thought government could and could not do. So let's start with the first one, the report on public credit. Hamilton is going to propose that the federal government should assume or take on the debt occurred by states during the Revolution. Now, this is a big deal because this would, of course, absolve those states of that debt, but also, put this federal government in debt right away. Now, some debt is, well, a lot of debt's a bad thing. Ask most people with credit card debt. Some debt, at least in this case, is not necessarily the worst thing. And what Hamilton's saying in this report on public credit is that, some debt is actually good, because if we are able to pay that back as a federal government, it increases our standing. It increases our reliability as a government, and other nations will take note of that. So basically, we're building up our credit, right? Now, I know it gets confusing. You're going to cover this in your personal finance classes, but each of you have a credit report, right? And, as you get old enough and you start to take on things like credit cards and bank accounts, if you pay your debt back, you have better credit. If you do not pay your debt back, you have worse credit. So what Hamilton's doing here is establishing the nation's credit and trying to say, if we want actual standing economically with other nations in the world, we have to take on some debt, and that could be taken on by the states. Now, some people oppose this. Jefferson, for one, opposed this, and namely because his home state of Virginia didn't have any debt. They had basically been responsible and had paid off that debt since the Revolution, and they had dedicated time and resources to do so. And so by the time they're getting to this period, his state, Jefferson's state of Virginia, has no debt. And guess who had the most debt? Hamilton's home state of New York. So Jefferson sees this kind of as a personal ploy to absolve Hamilton's own state of debt, but right away we have this clash going on between Jefferson and Hamilton. And by the way, that clash will continue to grow and will become the first two parties of the American political system, and we have remained a two-party system ever since. Even though there have been third parties that have popped up from time to time, it has remained a two-party system, and those parties have changed names and have changed ideas over time. But this is the beginning of that. Hamilton will eventually create the Federalist Party, and Jefferson will eventually create the Democratic-Republican Party, and those are kind of the basis of our two parties today, even. Now, the debt assumption plan, and this assumption plan, we actually see some cooperation here, because eventually Jefferson does give in, but he reaches a deal with Hamilton and other northern politicians where they make this deal where they say, okay, we'll assume the debt of the states. The federal government will assume that debt, but we want something in return. And that something was to move the capital of the country from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. D.C. was going to be a brand new city, a brand new district that was going to be formed between Virginia and Maryland, which is the South at that time. So what they're doing is they're agreeing to assume the debt of the country, of the states, in exchange for moving the capital to what they see as the South. Okay, now today we might not see D.C. as being in the South, but at the time it definitely was considered the South. Now, moving down to letter I there, the Whiskey Rebellion, 1791. Hamilton, after this assumption plan came into effect, you have to pay off your debt. So how do you do that? Well, Hamilton was responsible for America's first tax ever. The very first tax ever laid on the American people in the early republic was on whiskey. Now, today we would call this a sin tax, and things like alcohol and tobacco are heavily taxed. At this point, this was the first tax ever. And you might not think that a tax on whiskey would be seen as that big of a tyrannical move. But this led to full-out rebellion in some areas. Now, it's laughable on the surface. You have to understand the importance of whiskey in this early time, though. This was not just something that, people were going to the bars and getting drunk on. Whiskey was actually a very important commodity at the time. For many farmers, especially out in, western frontier areas, let's say that you harvest your wheat, you take what wheat you need to feed your family, you sell to local families. Now, if you want to actually sell that wheat to markets out east, it's actually very difficult to bound it all up and to transport. It's very bulky, right? A very easy way to distill that size down is to create whiskey out of your excess corn or what it may be. So a lot of farmers at this period were actually making whiskey and using it because it was easier to transfer out east. So you could actually make more money off selling whiskey and transport it easier than you could your actual crops. And so a lot of farmers were dependent on selling whiskey. Now, the problem here is that this was seen as an attack on farmers because they, even in the frontier areas, they actually used whiskey as currency. They would actually, they wouldn't have paper money in some places. They would actually exchange whiskey as currency in the frontier areas. So this was kind of seen specifically as a tax on the poor. All right, so right away we're seeing some of these arguments we still have today. Who do taxes affect the most? And here they're saying Hamilton's putting a tax on the poor farmers out west. This also had political implications because many of these farmers out west had gotten land. These were men that were veterans and had, as a part of their pension, gotten land from the government. And so basically you have a bunch of American Revolution veterans that are now being taxed by the government that they helped create in some ways. And so they're seeing that, especially in states where they've already paid, their state debt back, they're saying, why are we being taxed? They're seeing this as a political move. You also have this economic division that it creates because this was seen as, frankly, kind of class warfare because even at this time, there were some big distillers. There were people that made, large, vast amounts of whiskey. And in Hamilton's writing of this tax, he actually said that, you had two options to pay for this. You could pay for it in bulk. If you made bulk whiskey, you could pay a lower percentage rate in tax. And if you made smaller amounts, like most individual farmers would be doing, you had to pay a higher percentage. So what we're saying is he's showing favoritism to those businesses, to the corporations that are making whiskey, and actually taxing higher rates to farmers, individuals that would be doing it. So it's seen as class war. This thing had a lot of problems from the very beginning. At first, some of these farmers created petitions. That didn't seem to be going well. People, of course, they sent tax collectors out to collect it, and we see farmers tarring and feathering those tax collectors. It's never been a good time to be a tax collector. I mean, ever since biblical times, no one likes tax collectors. Even after Washington, who was very reluctant to sign on to this, by the way, even after Washington puts out a proclamation saying that this is the law of the land, you need to pay this tax, and you might not agree with it, but this is part of what being in a federal government is about. It basically led to full-on violence and insurrection. There were forces in some places that, they're amassing hundreds, many former veterans, trained soldiers, to basically riot against this tax. Washington, for the very first time in American history, at least under the Constitution, Washington is going to raise an army to put down this rebellion. He raises an army 13,000 men strong. That's an enormous army to put down this whiskey rebellion. And it was mainly centered in western Pennsylvania. By the time Washington gets there, and of course these veterans see who's leading the charge, many ultimately fled and the rebellion kind of died out. But the point was made. And frankly, Washington was applauded for his actions here because, people, it was decided whether you agreed with the law or not, you had to follow it. And, even though this was seen as perhaps a politicized tax, and it did affect different people differently, this was the first time that the president has actually enforced the law. And I think that's a pretty interesting moment in terms of the history of our government, but just kind of a crazy story that we almost came to full insurrection over a tax on whiskey. And by the way, you would also see the first presidential pardons, which I know here we are in whenever January 2020. We've seen a flurry of presidential pardons recently. The very first presidential pardon that was issued was by Washington over the Whiskey Rebellion. So it started very early on, that executive privilege. All right, moving on. The report on a national bank, and I promise this is going to be a lot shorter. That was the bulk of the lecture there. Report on a national bank, 1790. The question was, should a national bank actually be formed? It is not in the Constitution that the Congress has the power to do so, but it would be helpful, right? You can collect all this tax, but where do you take it? I mean, what do you do with the money? I mean, logistically, what do you do with it? So Hamilton says there should be a national bank, a bank that is owned by and operated by the federal government. It would make our job easier in collecting money and doing business. And so he is going to push this idea of a national bank. Others challenge that. In fact, Madison, who is a author of the Federalist Papers, actually challenges Hamilton here and says, no. That's not listed in the Constitution. You can't do it. And so we're getting into that implied powers. Most Southerners saw a national bank as being kind of counter to their benefit. A national bank would help northern industry versus southern agrarian, farming. There would be little benefit to farmers. There'd be potentially a lot of benefit in terms of like companies being able to take out loans and things from this national bank. So they saw this once again as a North-South issue, that this is going to benefit the North using America's money, whereas the South isn't going to get any benefit. And of course, we do have this issue settled, McCulloch versus Maryland, which decides that national bank, the implied powers, is something this would make their job easier to conduct business. And so a national bank was created, even though that would be challenged later on. And Washington was hesitant to sign it. I think Washington understood the ramifications of doing things outside of what was explicitly written in the Constitution. Moving on, letter C, the report on the establishment of a mint. Believe it or not, at this time period, the most commonly used coin was a Spanish real. I talked about how each state had their own currency. It made it very difficult to do interstate trade. But the Spanish real, which had, the Spanish, we just got done with our last unit on, the Spanish colonies. It was actually very prevalent in the American colonies. And again, it was, since it was so commonly used, it could be traded in between states and people understood it, its value, its trade value. And so anyways, Hamilton says, listen, if we really want to bolster the American economy, we need to put more faith in our own monetary system. And so he says we need to establish a mint, an agency that will create standard money for people to use. And 1791, he pushes that out there. And it is adopted in 1792, and the first U.S. mint is created. Letter D, the report on manufactures. And this was his last of the reports, but very, very influential. And I've focused heavily on this at the beginning about how he believed the future of America to become a strong economy needed to be centered on industry and manufacturing. So this was his third and final report. Fourth and final report, on how best to stimulate the new economy. And by the way, it wasn't just about money. Hamilton talks about how if you have a strong economy, you are truly independent. Right? If you are in debt to someone, if you are dependent on their imports, you are not free. And I think that's a fair argument to make. He's saying until we can actually produce the goods we need to survive, then we're going to be dependent on other countries. And so he says we need to start building. We need to start making our own goods. This is a very protectionist stance. And in fact, we see the nation's first tariffs come under Hamilton, where he says we need tariffs, which is a tax on an import. We need tariffs to basically protect American manufacturing. So, recently we've gone through a number of tariffs. In 2016, when President Trump was elected, put a number of tariffs on countries like China, right? So we put an aluminum tariff up, and my love for Diet Coke has been affected by this, by the way. A case of Diet Coke you might be able to find a case of Diet Coke for, I don't know, maybe $6. Today it's like $8.50. And in a few years, it should not go up $2.50. Well, that's a direct impact of the aluminum tariffs that we have placed on China, where we import aluminum and it becomes more expensive. And that's just a tax. That's a tax on the people. The problem with tariffs, by the way, is that the countries you place them on often turn around and put tariffs on you. And that's exactly what China has done to us in industries like soybean, which affects this area. And I believe I've mentioned this in the past. But anyways, it's a matter of debate, and it was back then too, on whether that is more beneficial to America or not. It's definitely not free trade. It's definitely not free markets. But Hamilton says that's necessary. We need to tax European imports so people buy American. So, for instance, if you have, let's say a pencil, okay, American-made pencils may cost $1 to manufacture, whereas European pencils may cost 75 cents to manufacture. So if it was completely free market, completely free trade, you could buy a 75-cent European pencil in America, and even if it was the exact same quality, most people would do that. What a tariff does is put a tax on that, to where now that pencil would cost $1.25. Well, again, if you're standing at the store and you can buy an American pencil for $1, or you can buy a German pencil for $1.25, you're going to buy American, and that keeps the money here. That's the purpose of tariffs. And again, there may be some immediate benefit, but in the long run, that tends to often bite you, as we've seen throughout history, and especially in the early 20th century. But early on, it was probably more impactful. And so Hamilton says in this report on manufacturers, we need to have a more protectionist economy. We need to have things like tariffs. He removes taxes for domestic manufacturing. So, like I said, the whiskey tax before, those businesses, really they're early corporations that are making large quantities of whiskey. He's removing some of those taxes, or at least lessening their impact so they can make more. Hamilton even promotes immigration. And of course, immigration would always be an issue. Of course, good thing that's gone away, right? Anyways, the immigration issue has always been one that's torn America apart. Should we basically try to get more people here? And, one side of the argument says that more people is better. You have more diversity, more culture. And the other side says, often they're going to be more dependent on things like welfare, and they're going to be a drain on society. And frankly, there's also a lot of racial views that are often incorporated with that. And that has always been the case. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act that came in the 1880s, I think, heavily racist. I mean, so there's always been this issue on immigration. How much immigration should we have? Well, Hamilton was all for it. He himself was an immigrant, so that might have played into it. But Hamilton was all for immigration, and in particular at this time, where, America is numbering less than 1 million people, he's saying, we need people. We need people to fill these factories in order to produce goods for us. So he will encourage immigration to basically better the situation in America. And he even kind of has a nod to Thomas Jefferson, which says, those people that are worried about the agrarian America, manufacturing can only help you. All right, because if we make more tax dollars through manufacturing, that's going to benefit the country in general, but also that it can make farming more efficient. And so he even puts in this report that even agrarian areas of our country would benefit from manufacturing. Kind of a tough sell, and I don't think Jefferson bought it. Of course, we would be remiss if we did not talk about the way in which Hamilton died. And again, I know if you're a fan of the musical, I don't know, you might even know more about this than I do. But anyways, it's one of the more dramatic events in American history because it pitted two extremely powerful men against each other in a duel, and we just don't see this too often. So let me give you some of the details. You might notice 1804. This is quite a bit after, it's like 15 years after those reports. So this is quite a bit later in Alexander Hamilton's life. And it's worth noting that by this point, he had actually resigned as Secretary of the Treasury and really had kind of resigned from public life. Now, he was very, very much still an insider and was pulling strings and was very influential. And in fact, he had really in some ways gotten Thomas Jefferson, his archenemy, elected as president in 1800, because if there was one person that Alexander Hamilton hated more than Thomas Jefferson, it was Aaron Burr. And so he actually concocted kind of this plan to where he got all the Federalists to try and oust Burr in the election. I'm going to talk more detail about the election later on. I won't get into that here. Aaron Burr hated Hamilton for that. He basically lost his role as vice president. He had been vice president under Jefferson. By 1804, Jefferson was very distrustful of Aaron Burr, and rightfully so. You'll see at the end of this story. Aaron Burr he kind of loses the vice presidency. He runs for governor of New York, loses it because of Alexander Hamilton. The dudes hate each other, and Hamilton, like I said, had resigned really from public life. They're actually one of the first sex scandals in American political history involved Alexander Hamilton. He was having an affair with a married woman, 12 years his junior. And in fact, when the husband found out, he actually began blackmailing Alexander Hamilton. And ultimately, it was discovered, it was published, and ultimately, he was still extremely influential, but not necessarily in the public eye as much. Let's get to the actual duel itself. What ended up happening, like I said, this animosity, especially over the election in 1804, where Aaron Burr lost the election to become governor and really felt that it was Hamilton's doing, that he had gotten powerful people to really attack Burr. In fact, Hamilton even had published a letter, which, and this is a quote, said that he had a still more despicable opinion of Burr. So even in their insults, they're fancy. Love it. Anyways, he saw it as an attack on his honor. And, you know, this is a topic I really have not mentioned much, but the idea of honor and duty in this society, it truly was, if someone insulted you in public, the idea that you had to defend your honor, that went a long ways. And, I know today we live in a society where you can really say anything about anybody. I see tweets about, politicians and, the president, whatever, just saying horrible, horrible things. And, no one really seems to bat an eye. But in this day and age, it carried different weight. And to remain respectful in society, you had to defend one's honor. Now, kind of an antiquated way people did that was by dueling and basically having a gunfight. But it was seen as even at this time, it was frankly illegal pretty much everywhere. What they were doing here was illegal, but it was just seen as an antiquated and barbaric way to settle these differences. And frankly, it usually never came to this. There were kind of stages that you went through where if you felt insulted, you kind of called the person out. If they didn't apologize, you escalated. You could even threaten a duel. And often, they would kind of admit, that you were a respectful person. And, often it wouldn't even come to a duel. Sometimes in a duel, if it came to where they actually were facing off, they would fire into the sky to kind of show that they were willing to defend one's honor to the death, but they did not care to take the other person's life. So with that background, let's get to the duel itself in July of 1804. The duel that takes place here between the former vice president of the country and the former secretary of the Treasury that takes place in 1804. Hamilton, the night before, of course, it gets to the point where they challenge one another. And Hamilton the night before is actually writing and speaking with friends, and he says that he really doesn't have any desire to take Aaron Burr's life. That he's actually morally and religiously against dueling, and he even tells some people that he plans to fire into the air. And like I said, that was a common tactic. Here you've defended your honor, but yet you're unwilling to necessarily take the life. The two men on the morning of July 11th, 1804, they actually crossed the Hudson River. So I think they're officially in New Jersey because it was illegal to duel in New York. But the two men go up on a ridge above the Hudson River. There are even witnesses to this. What's crazy about this is that because it was illegal, even the witnesses could get in trouble for being there. And so when the actual event happens itself, all of the witnesses turn around, so they don't witness it. And that actually leads to a lot of the speculation of what's about to happen because no one actually saw it themselves. All we have is really the word of Aaron Burr. So the two men take their paces and they start to walk them out. When they are told to turn and fire, Alexander, and again, this is where kind of the details start to falter a little bit. Alexander Hamilton, supposedly, who said he was going to fire in the air, apparently shot over the head of Aaron Burr. Okay, now that's not exactly firing in the air. And in fact, directing that volley, even if it was elevated above Aaron Burr, would still have been seen as an attack on Aaron Burr. And so he basically claimed kind of self-defense in this duel and pulled his revolver and fired on Alexander Hamilton and struck him right above the right hip, which at that time, I mean, any gut shot that was deadly. I mean, there's no recovering from that. So Hamilton, we don't know whether he fired into the air. We don't know if he fired over Aaron Burr's head. But Hamilton was struck, and he would be dead by the following afternoon, a very painful death. Now, Burr was charged with dueling. He did face a day in court. His political career was ruined. I mean, he had just lost the governor election, but could have made a rebound. He ended up actually moving west. And I'll tell you what, Aaron Burr has one of the most fascinating lives of any person I've ever studied, because when he moves out west, you might think he just retires and, lives off the woods and whatnot. And nah, Aaron Burr tries to create an empire. He will actually meet up with, I can't remember the guy's name, Livingston, I think, but he will actually work with another man of political ambition, and they will try to create an empire out of the newly purchased Louisiana territory. He sets himself up as an emperor, but nobody really follows him. And so when Jefferson finds out that Aaron Burr is trying to basically, sedition, treason, he actually sends officials out to arrest Aaron Burr. They bring him back out east. He is put on trial. He's actually acquitted during the trial. Perhaps it was just because of how well known and how embarrassing that would be to have a former vice president, tried for treason, which if he was found guilty would probably be killed. But Aaron Burr would eventually be acquitted and would live out the remainder of his days in Europe, where he ended up dying. His reputation just completely ruined in America. I mean, he went from vice president of the United States to potential governor of New York to all of a sudden killing one of the most famous founding fathers and a failed empire. Just a crazy, crazy tale, isn't it? Well, guys, that'll do it for me. Sorry, a little bit longer of a lecture here, but fascinating character, Alexander Hamilton, and one that truly defined the next few decades and, frankly, the next few centuries. I mean, we're still in this Hamiltonian, Jeffersonian split in some ways, and we'll talk about that more later on. Next time, we are going to have our last lecture of the semester, and we're going to take a look at the other side of the coin here. We'll look at Thomas Jefferson. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know if you have any questions.